January 2020. In January 2020, Google announced the deprecation would happen. And at the time, they positioned it as late 2021, early 2022. Given that we are in early 2022, I think you see what's coming, which is in June 2021. It was delayed until late 2023. And some of that may have to do with their topics API, which I'll talk about here in a second. Another critical thing that happened in that time frame was the move by Apple to require explicit opt-in and permission for device tracking. This was rolled out with iOS 14.5. You may hear the term IDFA, which is device identification. I can't remember the acronym right now, but this is what Apple uses to essentially get information out of the apps you use on your phone and share it with others. So a lot of folks who manage email campaigns and saw a lot of them saw significant drops from users who would have normally accessed emails on their mobile device using their Apple accounts. Now they can no longer see them. That's one of the key pain points, but certainly getting into more discrete app tracking and usage data is now more difficult as well. Just recently this year, last month, Google announced that they have a solution they are proposing as part of their privacy sandbox called Topics API. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. But just to pivot back to the cookie apocalypse, there's a lot of buzz about it. For some of you, this may really impact your day-to-day. You're developing ads, you're targeting users, leveraging some of these targeting mechanisms that are going to go away, and you need an alternative. Others of you, you may be several steps removed from the direct impact. So just to kind of summarize where some of the key pain points are going to be. One is personalization. So anything that relies on the behavioral and browsing data that these cookies collect to deliver something very targeted and very personalized, that's going to be hindered. So there are other ways of getting at this data. And again, we'll talk about some of the alternatives that are being proposed, but it is very much an active situation. There's no one solution to kind of supplanting this personalization that folks are going to lose as a result of these cookies no longer being able to transmit information from site to site as users browse the web. Campaign management is going to be affected. You may not think about this, but when you do an A/B test on a campaign, typically you would want your user to see either version A all the time or version B all the time. It's going to be harder to then ensure that the same user is seeing the same creative throughout their experience. It's also going to get harder to measure the frequency with which your users see your ads. So for example, if they see your ad on 10 different sites, maybe you would have capped that previously. Now it's going to be harder to total those touch points. Retargeting, as I mentioned, there are solutions coming out like Google's Fledge that are proposing ways to work around this, but efforts to retarget visitors are going to be hindered as well. And then finally, measurement and attribution. Some of the solutions that are kind of your quick fix attribution models that use cookies to track multi-touch attribution, they're going to see a hit and may need to reconfigure how they are tracking users across multiple touch points. And you may see even a shift back towards kind of last touch and first touch attribution while this kind of plays out. And people really try to understand the accuracy of some of these alternatives. as third-party cookies come into play. So a lot's going on here. And as I mentioned, there is no one clear winner. We'll talk about one of those proposals since it was recently announced, and you may have some questions about it. So Google Topics API is one of the proposed alternatives, and a lot of the solutions work kind of like this. This one is slightly different, and you may have heard before January about Google's proposal for a solution called Flock, which relied on cohorts to kind of group people who had similar browsing behaviors. There was a lot of concerns within the industry about this not being private enough. So the Topics API tries to take this a step further. It has been interesting to see Google navigate through this, as they have tried to respond to the feedback of folks in the industry. So they collaborated with the IAB, which is the Interactive Advertising Bureau, to come up with a taxonomy of categories that users could be grouped into as they browse. So you can kind of see how this plays out. Based on your browsing behavior, you are then kind of grouped into one of these categories or topics that reflect your interests. They're removing sensitive categories, so nothing like race, religion, politics. They're kind of stripping those things out. But as you start to think through the number of categories here, 350 isn't a whole lot. As you can see in this quote in the bottom right, this professional in the industry described this approach as grossly insufficient for the vast majority of modern marketers. So almost every solution that is being put in place does have some level of downfalls. This one's interesting. I think it's heading in an interesting direction. I think definitely the categories, again, you could probably come up with 350 sports related categories if you thought long enough about it. So, just it's going to need some time to mature, but it certainly is a move in the right direction for Google, because of two things. They're allowing users to kind of see and delete these topics, so you can have visibility as a user of Google Chrome into what you're being bucketed as. And they are kind of decentralizing the ownership of this data. So Google's not storing anything. They don't have access to the data. It's entirely stored on your device. Of course, I'm sure privacy watchdogs will be testing that. But it is one of these solutions that are being offered. Again, I think as I describe it, you can already probably play out in your head, well, what if the category is too broad? Isn't this just like the contextual advertising that I could get from just targeting a certain website? And the answer is yes. There's definitely some disadvantages to this. Just highlighting another example. This is something that was shared by Meta or Facebook, Mozilla, Firefox. They collaborated on this idea of interoperable private attribution, or IPA. I want an IPA after reading this. It's a little dense and complex, but there's a lot of players in this game right now. World Trade Desk has another proposal for a universal advertising ID, and it's really unclear right now on who the winner is going to be, and what's going to work for your company. Some of these might be just fine. It may be just fine for you to fall back on contextual advertising. We're working with companies to encourage proactive approaches to this. So doing pilots, testing out key campaigns with some of these new technologies, probably not putting all of your eggs in one basket quite yet, before you really test and learn from what approaches are going to work from an advertising perspective and supplant what you're relying on today. all of that's really important because it is a very volatile landscape right now. I'll move on from cookie apocalypse specifically because I think it does intersect with some of the other things going on in the privacy landscape. So nationally, I'm sure many of you are aware of this. There is new state legislation coming into place soon. So I know most of you guys have probably heard of CCPA. There is a additional bill coming out, going into effect in California called CPRA, which focuses a little bit more on the data security side of things, maybe not as much of a marketing UX focus, but it does still have some implications for how data is stored and managed. I think more importantly, Virginia and Colorado are putting in their own versions. I'm simplifying here, but their own versions of CCPA for their states. So what these laws essentially mandate is a right to access, correct, and delete personal information, and the right to opt out of data processing. So having those points in your user experience for people to manage their preferences, delete their information if desired, and to easily and transparently opt out is going to be critical. And there is a lack of federal guidance in the United States. And what we're seeing is a lot of states coming up with their own legislation to tackle this challenge. And what that means, in effect, is that a lot of organizations and enterprises who do business across the US are going to default to what is the worst case scenario so that I'm covered for all of these different laws. It's going to start to get very difficult to manage. Even if you're a regional business, is this person crossing the state border, and are they impacted by this Virginia law? Virginia is very close to home. So hopefully a lot of you guys are starting to consider what some of this legislation means for how you speak about privacy on your websites, in your emails, if you're setting up kind of customer data centers for them to manage their data. All of those things need to be considered. And then of course, internationally, it's a whole step up from what we're seeing in the United States. So GDPR went into effect in Europe in 2018, and that was a major upheaval for, I'm sure a lot of your organizations do business in Europe. China just released at the end of last year the PIPL data privacy legislation, which is very similar to GDPR. It is slightly less restrictive, but a lot of the same tenets hold true. And certainly for anyone who works in China, it's a very locked down, very tight ecosystem there. So definitely something to be aware of if you're doing business in China. And they're not the only countries headed in this direction. More than 120 countries now have some kind of legislation that requires data compliance. And a lot of them also have compliance laws about the transfer of data between countries. So that's where Google has recently gotten into trouble. France just found just this past month that Google Analytics, when it is transferring data from a European customer to their servers in the US, is actually in violation of GDPR, as well as the way that Google tracks individuals is also in violation of GDPR. So interesting legislation. Google hasn't really issued much in way of a response. And right now the burden is kind of falling on the folks who have actually implemented Google Analytics. For all of this, and I should have prefaced this before I even started, I'm not a lawyer. This is not a legal briefing on any of these laws. Highly recommend that if you have specific questions about your brand, and its adherence to GDPR in any given scenario. You consult with your legal team because it is a spectrum, it is a practice. We work with clients who have a much lower risk tolerance than others. For example, some of our partners in the pharmacy space are absolutely on top of this. Others who are more manufacturing, maybe they're smaller businesses, certainly they want to respect privacy law. They're not as wolfish about adherence. And while we always encourage people to be in the process of evolving into these privacy regulations and being able to manage and handle this data, certainly for some organizations, it's just not feasible to do that overnight. So all that to say, there's definitely a spectrum of how adherent people are. And you can see that headline on the right, 67% of the top 1,000 US websites are not GDPR compliant. So if you think you have gaps, you are probably not alone. And a lot of businesses are on this journey still, even since 2018. And I do just want to highlight one of the key things that GDPR impacts from an experience perspective, and that's consent. It is a legal requirement to get consent, and you're seeing this all over the web right now. If you go to any site for the first time, you will almost undoubtedly be hit with some kind of cookie notice, some kind of opt-in. Some organizations will not let you proceed to their site until you have kind of gone through that process. And we tend to hate that from a UX perspective because that adds friction to the experience. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but this is, I won't read through all of this. Essentially, you have to be really upfront with how you're collecting data. Users need to actively opt in to that collection. And you can't hide behind things like dark patterns, and you have to allow for easy withdrawal. So lots of challenging things here for a UX designer. And I'm sure some of you, if we have time to chat here at the end, have things to share. Any questions before I move on any of the things I just covered? Anything in the chat?
I don't see any questions in the chat. Lisa shared an article for tracking privacy legislation in the US.
Hey, I love that. It's awesome. Great. So I'll keep moving. 3 reasons to care about cookies and data privacy as a UX or CX practitioner. The first one is maybe a little bit obvious, but privacy can have consequences for your company and for your customers. And I think when I say the word consequences, everyone's mind is probably jumping to the monetary consequences, and they can be huge. GDPR can fine up to 4% of a company's annual revenue or $20 million, whichever is larger. So that has resulted in some really hefty fines, but if you're operating a website for yourself, you're probably not going to get hit with a $20 million fine, and very rarely have they been that high. The bigger challenge for those of us who maybe don't work for a Fortune 100 company is the brand implications of being called out for not being compliant. And that can be just as painful as the monetary repercussions. So you don't want to be known in perpetuity as the company that didn't look after its customers, didn't protect your customers' data. You don't want to have a breach, and you don't want to be flagged for any of these. So I want to be realistic with you about the consequences. And some of you do work for Fortune 100 companies. I know that, and you should be concerned and be on top of this, but that may not be the case for all of you. There's still a chance, and you don't want to put you or your company or your client at risk for both the monetary and the brand consequences that come with kind of missing these key steps. Reason 2 to care about these headlines is personalization. So I, like many of you, have felt like I've been on a quest for the past decade to reach this holy grail of one-to-one personalization with the customer. And this is definitely going to take us maybe a step or two away from this. There's going to be some setbacks as we try to balance personalization, privacy, and even if you're not directly impacted by what cookies or third-party cookies are doing, like some of you may have really robust first-party data. Like Amy, every time a person comes on my site, they log in, they give me all their info, they buy stuff from me. I know what they do, I know what they've done. Even then, just having to be upfront about the ability to opt out, the ability to delete that information, there's more potential for gaps in your personalization. So there's a lot of different ways people are kind of handling this. They're looking at some of the alternatives. They're looking at walled gardens, which I haven't talked a lot about, but like Facebook, Amazon, where you can still get very targeted with the information they are collecting about the consumer. But even then, they're also beholden to privacy laws, privacy regulations, and making sure their customers can opt out there as well. So be prepared for some setbacks here. Be prepared to maybe be asked to explore contextual targeting again, and be prepared to maybe think about, we've got to do something that's broader. We have to do something that's for everyone. Conversations may start to turn back there, or you may be looking at different channels to do some of this really targeted personalization versus what you were doing before. And then reason 3, and what I want to spend a little bit of time with, is that ultimately, I think that experiences that build trust are going to win in this new privacy landscape. And we can focus all we want on these compliance nitpicking regulations, but ultimately, if you get too laser focused on that, you're going to miss the opportunities that can come from this. And that's really using this to deepen relationships with customers, explore and test how you can get them feeling more comfortable with sharing personal data, and ultimately make it more likely that they will use your products and services. There was a study from the fall of last year. I have in my notes, 70% of respondents say they would consider paying more to feel that their data was protected. And 30% said they had already changed brands based on data protection factors. So that's not negligible. And you don't want to be the brand whose competitors are doing these things and are taking those customers from you. So absolutely important to stay on top of how you're talking to customers about these things, because they are going to start to notice. You've already noticed when you go to sites, you're seeing the pop-ups, you're seeing the language, and that's going to become very commonplace. So I've already voiced over a lot about where things are heading, and it really is kind of a weird catch-22 for a lot of your customers. There's definitely a tension of, consumers expect personalization. They expect their login details to be remembered. They're used to seeing some of these ads that follow them around the internet, but they also are starting to expect more and more that their privacy is respected and that they have control and options in these scenarios. So again, what we're seeing brands kind of pivot towards, and therefore what consumers are going to see, there's probably going to be some broader advertising campaigns. So ads may be becoming less targeted, or they may be coming through different channels than traditional digital advertising. Gated content and experiences. If you guys haven't started thinking about this as a solution to the cookie apocalypse, you probably will, because first-party data and getting users to opt into giving you information is one of the best ways to kind of future-proof yourself against some of these changing regulations. You'll see brands incentivizing people to give their information with free products, free content in exchange for that. There may be a shift back towards email marketing, which relies on a lot of that first-party data and allows you to get very targeted. And again, additional transparency and privacy and data use policies. So that's some of the things a consumer might start to feel. They may not feel necessarily that, oh, this ad isn't one-to-one me, but they are going to see some shifts in their experiences across the web as they're going to websites, as they're shopping, even as they're just browsing for educational content. So I've been throwing out these terms as if you know them. In case you don't know them, sharing a brief graphic of kind of where things sit. So all the way off to the right, you have third-party data, and this is where things are starting to get dicey with data privacy. So more and more third-party data and the transfer of third-party data is going to start being limited by some of these privacy regulations. So this is data that is collected by an aggregator of some sort, like a cookie. It is data that you can purchase. And often you're not really interacting with the customer at all when it comes to this data. So they're interacting somewhere else, or they may be even unknowingly giving some of this data, and it is being collected. And this is what a lot of the privacy laws are trying to protect users from, is kind of this black box of data collection. We won't touch much on second party data just due to time. I do want to focus on this zero and first party data, which is really the holy grail. And the distinction is just slight between the two. The zero party data is strictly used for the user's experience, whereas first party data, they're at least opting it in and collected. It may not directly impact the user's experience, but it does conform to the company's compliance and governance policies. Ultimately, both of these types of data are data given with consent directly to you as an organization. And this is the stable ground in all of this shifting privacy landscape, is getting clear consent from users to opt into this. So I want to talk a little bit more about how you do that. And to do that, I want us all to think about our lovely smart devices. I'm sure most of you have these. It's a very interesting dichotomy. In that Cisco state of data privacy review I referenced at the beginning, almost 60% of consumers are concerned about how businesses are using AI. So that's on one end of the spectrum. At the second end of the spectrum, another poll noted that for everyone who has an Amazon Alexa, about half of respondents say they keep one of these devices in their bedroom. So let's try to mentally combine those two things. That is completely insane. Why do we do this? Why do we let this robot in our bedroom? And the reason is some really smart UX design. Alexa is listening all the time, but you may not feel like it. And that is because within the user experience, you have to say the wake word, Alexa, for it to really process anything. You expect to see that blue ring light up to indicate that it is listening. And when those things aren't happening, you kind of forget, you get relaxed. So there's this positive friction in the experience. You can't just call on Alexa on a whim. It's not always talking to you or listening to you. There is a friction in that experience that stops that from feeling intrusive and lets you essentially opt in to the exchange with Alexa. And there's a lot of other smart things Amazon has done with Alexa. I don't know if you all know this, you can actually ask Alexa if you can review the privacy policy. She will send it to your phone. You can ask Alexa to erase her entire memory of everything you have ever said to her, and she will do that. You can ask Alexa, why did you do that, after anything that she's done? And she will tell you. And all of those are things that Amazon has built it. They actually have a director of Alexa Trust who comes up with things like this and is really working to build trust in this very, very much AI-driven thing that we have all invited into our homes. And you may not have even thought about some of these things, and You may not have even processed that you are not comfortable. But that just leads to what I want to talk about for the final few slides here, which is how we can use UX as a recipe for positive friction and trust building. So these are kind of the three elements that I think need to be baked in at each step in kind of a consumer's interaction with us when we're exchanging information, when we're opting in or out of information. And adhering to these generally will also let you adhere to GDPR and CCPA. It will help you get the first and zero party information that you need to have kind of stability in this crazy time. And those three things are taking the time to teach consumers, giving them control, and delivering in-kind value. So I'll quickly talk through what this looks like at 4 key points in the privacy user experience. So often we have a notice of data collection. This is that little pop-up that comes up on the site and tells you, hey, we're here, we're listening. You should probably click this button to accept that we're doing this, or you may need to opt out. And you can see some examples here from New Balance, GameStop. You can, I'll call out a few things here, but as you think about this, you can use plain language, avoid cliches, clearly describe why you're asking and what the impact will be of either choice, giving both opt-in and opt-out options, being really clear. I think GameStop example does a great job of making the opt-out option very clear, and articulating the value. You know, it's very easy to kind of click through here without thinking. I know I do this very often on sites. I'm like, please get this thing out of the way. I just want to go through, but this is an opportunity to say, this is what we're doing for you. This is the value we're bringing to your experience. This is what we provide. And GameStop took the opportunity to do this by saying, personalize my ads. While I don't find that a very appealing value proposition, I get that. I appreciate the effort. You know, maybe personalize my experience may have been how I would have phrased that, but there's opportunity in these notices to really talk to your users like they're people, give them control. I've mentioned dark patterns a few times, but be very careful with those. Some of the legislation actually actively has clauses that rule out things like putting extra emphasis on the accept button and kind of downplaying the opt-out button. You want to kind of make it equal. You want the choice to be apparent, and you want the reason for that choice to be apparent as well. Then you have kind of your opt-in process. That may look like a gated form. It may look like a sign up. It may look like your shopping cart. This is another great opportunity for teaching, giving control, and describing your value. And this really is the point of value exchange. If they don't know why they're giving you their information at this point, you have a huge problem. So articulate your value on your landing pages. Obviously, if they're in a shopping cart, they probably know what they're buying. But you know, if you're asking, hey, do you want to opt in to phone communications? How are you going to use that? What are you going to text them? Are you going to text them when their order's on the way? Be clear about what they're getting. I like the RSVP's example here with the really visual options. I mean, it's not just a wall, there's a little bit of wall of text going on, but it breaks it up. It gives you some control. It helps you feel like you're kind of tuning your experience. And those just-in-time explanations of why am I clicking on this specific button, or why am I going through this specific step, can be really impactful. Not just as a description at the top of the page, but something that kind of helps them understand as they're going through the process. What effect did I just have, or what am I doing? If you, one concern I know we have as UX designers is making these things super long, millions of steps to go through, and certainly adding selections like these is not making it any shorter, but use the opportunity to show progress. Use your progress bars if you're doing split things into multiple pages, make them feel digestible. You know, some of the key things you've probably already implemented in some of your forms or checkout processes still apply here. You may not think about this, but your privacy page is another opportunity. And GDPR actually does outline, you know, the goal is to make these pages readable. The old kind of cliche of your privacy page as being a massive wall of legalese. Some of these laws are really pushing to not do that. Certainly that is slightly subjective, but I think Google does a good job of their privacy policy. You know, they've split it into sections. It's easy to digest. They don't just have text, they have videos, they have imagery. The language is plain. You can really use this as an opportunity to illustrate value. So we collect your data because we're giving you this in your product. When you buy our product, you get this value. So using the opportunity to reinforce that, and of course, continuing to give them control. A good privacy policy will, you know, not bury the things that allow them to manage their preferences or opt out, but make it very simple to understand what they can do with those tools that you've provided them. And then finally, I've referenced this a few times, kind of your preference center is one of your other key points to optimize. I actually love a lot of what ASOS does from a privacy perspective. They're in a lot of use cases on the web. They've done a really good job of kind of breaking out the discrete things you can opt into and out of, and that's really best practice, especially under GDPR. You want to be sure that there's not just a one big opt-in bucket, but that people can be discreet about, yeah, you can text me, you can email me, and what types of communications. So a marketing communication might be different than a order summary, for example. ASOS goes out of their way here to say, are you still happy with what you get? You know, you can tweak it here, calling out that you are in control. And again, this is an opportunity to show the value you're providing. So, hey, we go out of our way to send you SMS messages. You should opt into them because we're going to tell you when your order's on the way. So again, using plain language here, all of these are great opportunities to build that trust with your customers and build your brand as well. Some data deserves more friction than others. Not all data is created equal. I won't go into this. You know, taxes, not a simple process. You can see here in this right-hand graphic, different countries value different types of information differently. In the US, the biggest, most valued information is your government identification. So I would personally expect any process where I'm entering my social security number better be secure. They better be telling me this is why they're using it, and I better understand what it's being used for. So I don't care if they take a little bit more time to explain that to me. I want to be sure it's being used in the right way. In Europe, health information is really big. And China, the biggest one is digital communication, although China and privacy are a tricky subject. All of this to say, just going back to our graphic at the beginning, I can give you as many pointers as you want. No amount of fine tuning is really going to replace a valuable outcome. I have suffered through plenty of horrific forms and invasive sign-up processes to do something that I found necessary, that I found of value, even to download a white paper that I put in a folder and I never looked at again. I've entered my information, and you probably have too, but maybe didn't come away with the warm and fuzzies for that brand. Where you're really going to win is getting to that ideal state of promoting your brand, bringing value, and driving a positive experience for your users while also building your customer data profiles. So yeah, if you think back to our chart, top right, ideal, bottom right, or bottom left, you have a problem. And for those items that fall into that bottom right quadrant, that's really where you have an opportunity to optimize your experience. So think about, you know, how your different touch points with consumers kind of play out, and where you can really move the needle. So I know I've gone a bit over 7. Thank you for bearing with me. I would love to hear your ideas and questions.
Thanks, Amy. That was great. We do have one question in the chat from Hunter. It says, how are these changes affecting client focus and spend on organic paid search? It also seems that this will increase the level of empathy required with target markets to ensure search traffic is maximized.
That's awesome. I haven't seen, so paid search targeting is usually very contextual, right? You're targeting keywords, you're targeting, you're kind of trying to put yourself in the user's shoes and think about, what am I searching at any given moment in time? If anything, I've seen brands shift more towards search versus some of the programmatic advertising that does rely on those cookies. And I think it's a great alternative for, especially if you have a really good understanding of your customer, their journey, where they may be at when they are leveraging, you know, Google Bing and searching for your products or relevant information. I think it can be really powerful as an alternative to some of the advertising avenues that cookies enabled. It's a great question.
I've got a follow-up question too, Amy.
Yes.
So in some of your examples where customers are choosing their, you know, level of opt-in or not, you know, I think all of us are very familiar with just the level of like legal and technical jargon that is like on those pages, which I think is inherently not,
It's pretty bad.
Yeah, it's like not a good thing for user experience. I guess I'm kind of curious on your current understanding of brands and in terms of being required to put that information verbatim at, you know, on those modals. Like, is there a way to where it can be truncated or condensed
Yes.
to, you know, like mold in with UX writing and while also, you know, being compliant? So
that's such a good question. Yes. I'm so glad you brought this up. I think LinkedIn does this pretty well, or they used to do this well. My recommendation is, if you're forced to put legal language on a page, consider following it with a plain language summary of, this is what this means, or have some kind of summary at the top or bottom of the page to kind of process all of that. Because yes, you are right. I've worked with legal teams. They like to be very specific in their language. And some of that does have very specific meanings and very specific contexts, maybe not a context that you or I would appreciate or your customer might appreciate on a given basis. But yes, some brands do kind of have that dual experience of like, here's the legal portion and here's the takeaway, or you know, again, having summaries somewhere on the page that kind of summarize a section or an entire kind of like tab of information. Cool. Any other, anyone had any run-ins with data privacy challenges, whether from cookies or otherwise? There's a whole other realm of this, right, which is storing the data, managing the data, which I'm probably not the best person on my team to talk about, but that is certainly a challenging piece as well. You may be ready to do the UX stuff, but you may not be ready for what it means of how you manage that data on the back end. So for example, you could put as many opt-in and opt-out buttons as you want. If they don't do anything and you're not storing that and you're not actively managing the user's data, it's a whole other set of challenges that kind of lie behind that experience.
Yeah, I thought your bringing up Alexa was interesting. I was visiting a friend a couple weekends ago, and she was watching a dog. She doesn't have a pet of her own, and she had an Alexa in the room. And we were talking about Alexa and like level of privacy. And then later that weekend, she showed me that she had gotten an ad in social media for like, we were talking about the dog having bad breath. And then she got like a social media ad about, does your dog have bad breath? And like she doesn't own a dog. So it was really interesting that it seemed like Alexa was like sharing that
Oh, I
information.
think we've all had those experiences.
Yeah.
I have a Google Pixel and I swear it knows everything. I think it listens to my text. I think it knows any news story I click on. And same thing with the smart devices for sure. So yeah, I won't be an Amazon spokesperson on this call. I can't account for what they are and aren't using. But you still have it in your house at the end of the day, which is part of what makes my head spin. But obviously it's adding some kind of value, or also get rid of them.
So I guess going back to just the discussion on trying to put a friendlier summary or some more information around all the legal ease to help users understand what it is that they're agreeing to. Is it difficult? Like, I feel like sometimes you get pushback from legal when you try to add things or interpret what they're saying, and just curious, like, if there are any tips for kind of how to negotiate that.
Yeah, that is always going to be a major challenge, especially if you're working in a highly regulated. I mean, I've worked with big oil clients, and I think their legal people have to literally sign off on every single word they've ever put out in public. So I think your mileage is going to vary on that one, unfortunately. I mean, in terms of tips, I mean, I hope they'd have an appreciation that not everyone comprehends the implications, and that you're coming from a place of wanting to be clear and explain to the users while also featuring the very specific legal language, and you want their collaboration on it. I don't know if that'll be successful in every single instance. I've worked with clients where I know that would be a very, 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 very challenging fight to win, if they're not willing to play ball. But you know, I would hope there would be some common ground between wanting to be protected, and making that a positive experience for the end user. And you know, again, if I can try to find some additional examples online of companies who do that well. If you can find examples from around the web that like, look, this is a thing people are doing. This is not insanity that I'm speaking to you. This is actually a thing an accredited organization who cares about not getting sued does, and they do so successfully. That could be potentially move the needle for some people.
Amy, I'm curious what your advice would be for like smaller companies who do not have easy access to legal counsel, and what advice you would give them.
Yes, if you do those three things and make it transparency is the great fallback of all of this. I would err on the side of being upfront and collecting, whenever you collect data, being very clear about its use and how it's stored, and what you're doing with it. I know that's easier said than done. And I think, again, there's something to be said for being at least even being on the journey of getting there, even if you don't have all the tools at your disposal to set up a privacy center and all that stuff. You know, there's, when these fines have been levied, you know, they're not going up to $20 million. You know, there's levels of, you know, how people are getting penalized for this, and certainly showing effort has made a difference for organizations who are kind of negotiating these. So not to say that you as a small business owner would ever end up on the side of that, but I think the easiest thing to do, even if it involves extra effort, is to play it safe, because ultimately where we're seeing things go is the way of GDPR. If you don't know, if your clients, for example, I've had lots of conversations with this. How do we know if someone's coming from Europe? What if they're based in California, but they're buying something in Ohio? And part of me just wants to scream, just do the right thing. Just tell them, just set it up and just do it. because that is kind of where things are headed. So I would encourage you to start the journey towards that, if you haven't, as the safest route. And certainly I haven't worked with any independent lawyers, but I'm sure we could reach out to our networks and find someone who'd be willing to give you some quick counsel or answer a quick question as well, if there's anything really specific you're kind of hung up on or challenged with. I don't know if that answered your question.
It does. It does. I appreciate the time on that. I work at an agency that has, we work with quite a few small businesses. So this is a topic that comes up pretty frequently, not just with, you know, the cookie consent, but also even, you know, with writing privacy policies that they have on their website. There's a lot of clients that will come to us and ask for us to actually create those privacy policies for them without consenting their own legal counsel, which of course is concerning to us and not something that, you know, we're taking on. But I was just curious to hear your thoughts on that. So thank you.
Yeah, as someone who works as a consultant, unless you are a lawyer yourself, I would definitely encourage them to hire legal counsel who is looking out for their behalf.
Absolutely.
And knows their full business, because that's just not reasonable
Right.
for them to ask you to be that knowledgeable about their inner workings. So
I would, secondary question, I was curious to see that you had recommended, you know, gravitating more towards gated content for collecting personal information. It's kind of always been my view that gated content is not always a good thing from a UX perspective, because you're requiring personal information in order to give the user valuable information. So you're kind of, you could be damaging the relationship in some ways.
Sure.
So I'm just curious to see that you had seen success with that. Would love to hear a little bit more about how you've been doing that, I guess, and what type of content or free content you've been giving out.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it should definitely be selective. I don't think I would generally wouldn't recommend gating all of your content unless you're the New York Times and want to sit behind a paywall or something like that. It is a balance. It is a balance of, you know, I come from a marketing background, so I'm like, I want to know about the customer. I want to track these leads. I want someone to email next month when we're sending out invites to our webinar. So I get the impulse to look for any and every opportunity to get someone to opt into communicating with you, which is what you're saying is the negative. And it can be obtrusive. I think it all goes back to, where does the content or experience that you're offering sit on a spectrum of value. If it's something that I should be able to reference, that I have to have to make a decision to purchase from you, that is just base level knowledge, I would not gate any of that. If it's content that you see users searching for all the time and it's driving a bunch of organic traffic to your site, I wouldn't gate that. I would gate the things that feel like thought leadership, or you know, add or step away from something that you would pay for. So like a report or an ebook, something maybe a little more formal packaged, or offer them an experience like, you can use this pricing tool to get a quote on something, but hey, enter your information, and we'll email it to you. So I would agree with you that using gated content in the wrong way is not the right experience for your customers. At the same time, I think probably a lot of us can think of a time where we were like, okay, I'll fine, I'll put in my stuff and we'll move on with my day, and I'll download it. But yeah, it definitely needs to not be every piece of content needs to be your high value.
That makes sense. Thank you, Amy.
Yeah. And I realize it's a challenge to know where that line is.
It's a fine line.
We probably have time for one more question. If anybody else had anything they wanted to ask Amy. All right. Well, thanks for an excellent presentation. I learned a lot, and a lot of really great things to think about. I hope you all got to take away some best practices for the experiences that you work on.
Thank you guys. Connect on LinkedIn. I'll post my info here.
Great. And please don't forget about World IA Day Cincinnati. I put a link again into the chat, and it should be a great event. It'll be both virtual and in person. So hope we can see you all then.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you guys.
Good night.
Appreciate it.
Bye.